So, hoisting may sound a bit confusing to you, but it's really not, believe me. So let me prove it to you by writing some code. So once again, I have some starter code for you, which I put here on my desktop. So let's just go to our text editor and open up the project. And in my case, it's brackets. And I have brackets and Google Chrome here side by side, such as we had before. So in case you're using brackets, just hit this button here and then hit open folder. And in my case, it's here on the desktop. So I'm just going to open this project and here we are. So in this project, I have once again our simple HTML file, which is this bare construction of the HTML file, just the structure. And this time I already have included the script, which is also here already. And I have also already set the stage here for this lecture. Okay, so I'm just going to use some very simple functions here because I just want you to focus on how everything works and not exactly on what the code is doing. Alright, so let's start by writing a simple function, and we can actually use the one we have been using before, so the calculate age function. And remember, we have been writing it like this. Calculate age and then year. And this time we don't even want to return anything. I'm just gonna console log the result to the console. So 2016 minus the year. Very simple, but it's enough for us. So this is how we've been doing it up until this point. So we first declared the function and then called the function. So I'm going to use calculate age and let's say 1990, which used to be John's birth date. And now I'm going to open up our file, our HTML file, and here we go. And the console, so I told you in the last section that we can do inspect to open the console. But we can also come here to the View menu in Google Chrome, Developer, and then the JavaScript console, which is the same as hitting this shortcut, so Alt-Command-J on a Mac and probably Alt-Control-J on a PC. Alright, and here we already have the result. Okay, so this is the way we have been doing things. But with what we learned in the last lecture, we can also do it the other way around, right? Let me show it to you. I'm going to delete it and use the function here before I actually declare it. Let's see how this works out. Calculate age, and let's now put 1965, for example. And if I now reload this, then this still works. Okay. And this is what I've been telling you about in the last lecture. So this is hoisting. So in the creation phase of the execution context, which is in this case the global execution context, the function declaration calculate age is stored in the variable object, and even before the code is executed, right? And this is why when we then enter the execution phase, the calculate age function is already available for us to use it. So we don't have to first declare the function and then use it, but we can also first use it like this and only later in our code declare it. Now remember another thing that I said in the last lecture, which was that this only works for function declarations, but there's also something called function expressions, right? So let's see how this works out with function expressions. So let's write another function as a function expression. And this is how we do it. So we declare a variable, and now we're going to reuse the function that calculates the years that we have left until retirement based on the year of birth. So I'm going to call it simply retirement. And then function and the parameter year. Okay, we just want to console log here the result. And the way we have been doing this is to make 65 minus the age. So it would be 65 minus the age, and the age is just 2016 minus the year, right? Okay. And we need the parentheses here because we want this part to be calculated first, and only after that we want then 65 minus this part of the operation. And remember, if we group something together with parentheses, it gets the maximum precedence in the operation precedence table, right? So this is the absolute priority. Okay, so let's now use this first like this. So retirement 1990, and hit reload, and here we go. So for someone who was born in 1990, it has 39 years left for retirement, right? So now let's try and see what happens when we do it like this. So the way we have done it up here. So I'm gonna go ahead and delete this and try to first call the function and only after that to write it in the code. So retirement, and let's try again 1965, and then let's use it. Okay, and now this time it does not work. So this is what we expected, right? And once again, the reason for that is because this function is not a function declaration, but a function expression. And hoisting with functions only works for function declarations, which is what we have here, right? Okay, great. So in order to make this work again, I'm just going to commit out it here, but I will leave it in the code so that you can have it for yourself and download this code at the end. Okay, so that is function hoisting. Now remember that hoisting also happens with variables, but in a different way. So let's see some examples about that. So here we have functions, and take away this space here. So here, variables. So let's once again create a variable here, and I will create an age variable. So age, and set it simply to 23. And just to check that everything works, let's console log this variable just to see what happens. Okay, 23, exactly as expected. Now, what happens if we use this variable before we actually declare it in our code? So let's see what happens in this case, console log age. So again, we're trying here to use this variable before we declare it in our code. So I'm sure you know by now what's going to happen. So here we go. All right. So we have undefined, and that's exactly how hoisting works with variables. Because remember, in the creation phase of the variable object, what happens is that the code is scanned for variable declarations, and the variables are then set to undefined. So imagine that we wouldn't even have this variable declaration here. If we then attempted to use the variable, we wouldn't get undefined, but we would get exactly an error, because then we wouldn't have any definition and JavaScript would not even know this variable. But in this case, JavaScript knows that there will be an age variable. We simply don't have the value yet. And that's also the reason why it's defined exactly as undefined, because in one of the first lectures we saw that variables that don't have a value yet will always have the data type undefined. Okay, so let's now take this one step further and write a small function called foo, which doesn't accept anything. All we're going to do here is to create our own age variable right inside this function. And let's set this one to 65, for example, and then console.log age in here, then call the function like this, and then console log the age again. So what do you think is going to happen in this example? So let's find out. Okay, so these are the results of these two console logs here, right? So line 26 and 29, so 26 and 29. So why does this console log here print the age of 65 and then this console log here prints the age of 23? So it's actually pretty simple, and it's because this age variable here gets stored in the global execution context object, right? So in the variable object of the global execution context object. Sounds a bit confusing, right? But if you go through the last lectures again, then it will make a lot of sense. So again, this age variable is declared in this global execution context object. And then this foo function here gets its own execution context object, in which we can also store an age variable, and it can be the same name. It really doesn't matter, because these are two completely different variables. This variable age is defined in the variable object of the execution context object of the foo function, while this age variable is defined in the variable object of the global execution context object. So each one gets its own variable object, so we have two different variables, and so the results when we print them are different. And we can see that the hoisting works indeed also the same way. Console.log. So if we attempt to print the age before we declare it here, then we will have also undefined. So an undefined comes here from line 25, which is this. Okay, so I hope hoisting is a lot more clear to you now. And the most important use case for hoisting is not even variables, but it's the fact that we can use function declarations before we actually declare them in our code. And that's the biggest takeaway from hoisting actually. So this is something very useful and something that confuses new JavaScript developers. So I hope that you understand it with these lectures. So you can take another look at the code or even rewatch some of the lectures that we've just seen. And then after that, once you're ready, then let's just move on to the next lecture.